Okay, welcome everyone. Today we are going to talk about the Vilnius summit and Turkey's relations with the US. And the title of the panel is NATO's Vilnius summit and its potential impact on Turkish-American ties. There will be a NATO summit very soon on the 11th and 12th of July in Vilnius, and many important topics and NATO's agenda will be discussed at the summit. And today, Turkish-American relations and their context within NATO and the developments within the context of NATO's Vilnius summit is the topic of our panel. Very distinguished speakers today, Ambassador Fatih Ceylan. He is the director of Ankara Policy Center, and Sıtkı Egeli, he's an associate professor at İzmir University of Economics, and he also has experience in the defense industry. And Şafak Erdem, he's the founder of the Global Trade Forum, and this panel is organized in cooperation with Ankara Policy Center and Global Trade Forum. I don't want to take much of your time as the moderator of this panel, and I would like to give the floor to Ambassador Ceylan and his opinions about what's going to happen in NATO's Vilnius summit within the framework of global security, Russia-Ukraine war, maybe Ukraine's potential membership to NATO, the discussions around Ukraine's membership to NATO, also very problematic in Turkey's relations with NATO, the Swedish membership. So, Ambassador Ceylan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I should like to extend my thanks to Global Trade Forum for co-organizing this important webinar today, the joint webinar between Ankara Policy Center and Global Trade Forum, the first of its kind, and let's hope that this cooperation will continue in the future. Well, let me first and foremost thank my co-panelists and certainly our moderator, Professor Dr. Sinem Akgül Açıkmeşe. This is indeed an important event taking place at a time very close to the Vilnius summit that will take place on the 11th and 12th of July, which means 3 weeks later. Last year at the Madrid summit in June 2022, NATO adopted a new strategic concept after 12 years. The last one was in 2010 at Lisbon. So from June 2022 till now should be seen as an implementation year. By that, I mean it's a common practice in NATO to transform itself, to adapt itself to new circumstances after adopting a new strategic concept. And this is exactly where we are. The term defined in the heading of my presentation, NATO's global vision, is very seminal and correct, since NATO felt the compelling need before the Madrid summit to have a global outlook, to strengthen its political pillar, which was rather lagging behind the collective defense core task of the alliance. And this approach, this global outlook or global vision, had been elaborated by the NATO 2030 United for a New Era report, which was prepared by an experts group. And there it was explicitly stated that NATO needs a global outlook with a reinforced political role to play. But that does not mean that NATO will be the global gendarmerie. I mean, that will never be the case, because of the provisions that are clear in the Washington Treaty of 1949. So it will not be a global policeman, as some critics of NATO claim that it would be in the future. That should be debunked first and foremost. Now, let's go step by step. At the Madrid summit, the alliance identified two main threats. That's Russia and terrorism. Russia as the most direct and significant threat for the alliance, a conventional threat, whereas terrorism is the most direct asymmetrical threat in all its forms and manifestations. On China, there's a different story, because there are again many speculations on what the alliance would do vis-a-vis China. China isn't defined as a direct military threat for the alliance, but a competitor and an economic and strategic rival for the West at large. Maybe with some implications for the alliance in the future, but it is 100% true that the alliance will not develop, quote unquote, a collective defense plan against China. That's not the issue, and that will not be the issue, at least in the foreseeable future. Second, the current toxic, I would say, global picture entails the ongoing Russian aggression in Ukraine, that's Russia, and the growing rivalry between the US and China, not limited to the Indo-Pacific region, but extending to a much wider geographical area and domains of activity, be it in technology, particularly technology. It's a geopolitical and geostrategic rivalry which is deepening day by day between the United States and China. Third, the summit, this Vilnius summit, will not consist, or rather will not focus solely on Turkey, the United States ties. So we should try to see the broader picture in terms of Turkey-Western ties. Therefore, Turkish-US ties are certainly an important component of the summit, but not the only aspect of it. Neither can we separate Turkish-American ties from the nexus, for instance, between G7 and G20. So all of these components or aspects that will put their imprint on the summit constitute an integral structure which will certainly affect Turkey-American bilateral relations. Now, at the upcoming summit, there will be three key topics for the NATO leaders to address. The first is certainly the Ukrainian membership issue, as Professor Açıkmeşe underlined at her introductory remarks. The second, which is also a critical topic for Turkey, is Sweden's potential accession to NATO. And the third is the transformation of the alliance's force and command and control structures. So let's start with the first one, Ukraine. What I expect from the summit, from what I read and what I see, is that membership will not be granted to Ukraine. I can say it, in confidence. There could be a strongly worded separate statement on Ukraine, or a few paragraphs dedicated to it within the joint summit communique, repeating the decision taken back in 2008 and offering, most probably, security guarantees or assurances for Ukraine, short of membership, because membership means the implementation of Article 5, which is the backbone of collective defense for the alliance. I think that will not be granted to Ukraine so long as the Russian aggression in Ukraine continues. And the depth and the content of these security guarantees remain to be seen. But I'm sure that there will be some strong commitments in terms of providing military and other assistances to Ukraine, but we will see it. This will be the topic to decide by the NATO leaders. What type of security guarantees to be given to Ukraine on the occasion of the Vilnius summit? Let's come to Sweden as the second key theme. This is an issue that is of direct concern for Turkey, Hungary, but I mean for all members of the alliance. And I hope by the time of the Vilnius summit, a common ground could be reached to finalize the membership process of Sweden. Maybe another option would be to find a solution at the summit venue. There are examples of that in the past. Thus far, we have not seen any solid movement on the part of the Turkish Grand National Assembly to ratify the accession protocol of Sweden, which further complicates the picture as things stand now. It seems that the issue is tied to the procurement of F-16s from the United States, and I think this issue will be elaborated by other two co-panelists in detail. Now, if no solution is found, which is the third option, by the summit or at the summit, now this would put another serious dent in not only Turkish-US relations, but Turkish-Western ties on a wider scale. So this would be a dangerous path to take, and let's hope that a common solution would be found by the time of the summit. The third key theme is the transformation of NATO on the basis of last year's strategic concept. And when we talk about it, it's become evident that the collective deterrence and defense task of the alliance is at the forefront, and the deterrence and defense of Euro-Atlantic area would, in my opinion, be further strengthened by the decisions to be taken by the alliance leaders. Now, it's highly likely that the force and command and control structures of the alliance will have to be further adapted to new circumstances. Particularly, I'm talking about the set of additional measures to be introduced against the ongoing Russian aggression on Ukraine. So a radical change, particularly in the force structure and posture, force posture of the alliance, would be in sight. And that will have ramifications for the 5 operational domains of NATO. That is to say, land, air, sea, cyber, and space. And these could be tied to new defense plans. And there could be more emphasis on regional planning based on regional specificities to reinforce the overall deterrence and defense of the alliance. And that's very interesting, because when the alliance started to carry out, first and foremost, to kind of formulate defense plans, immediately after its foundation back in 1949, there were a series of regional plans for different regions of the Euro-Atlantic area. And in mid-50s, there was a transition from regional planning to collective defense planning. Now we will be back to square one. Most probably there would be 3 regional defense and deterrence plans for the alliance to be endorsed by the leaders. And the regional focus will be reintroduced in alliance defense planning. So that's all I would like to say. Three main topics. That is the Ukrainian membership issue, what would happen with Sweden's application for membership in NATO, and also a rather a topic that's not very much favored by the Turkish public opinion. That is the adaptation of NATO's command, control, and force structure and posture. I think these will be the main key themes that will dominate the agenda of the Vilnius summit. So thank you very much once again for your patience and for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ceylan. Actually, those topics that would appear on NATO's agenda, the Vilnius summit agenda, are somehow related to Turkey's Western ties, as you mentioned, specifically in the case of Sweden, and also Turkey's adaptation to NATO's renewed or transformed force structures. By Turkey's Western ties, of course, it means Turkey's transatlantic ties and Turkey's relations with the US. And when it comes to the Swedish membership issue, Turkey-US had talks over the topic, and this became a controversial item on Turkish-American relations. Now, I would like to give the floor to Sıtkı Egeli, and I would like to start with posing the question, what are the main issues in Turkish-American relations, specifically in the case of defense industry and F-16s? What is the geopolitical importance and how it impacts the relationship between Turkey and the US? I'm not, of course, asking the US-American relation, US-Turkish relations in a in a deeper context, but just can you summarize what is the issue of F-16s and what is the geopolitical importance of those?
Thanks a lot, Sinem Hocam. Even this limited, confined framework you have drawn for me is probably going to take hours normally to elaborate. But I would like to start first by thanking the organizers for this splendid opportunity with very three distinguished colleagues I have on the panel. And I'm going to go very fast. I mean, perhaps I should start with the second part of your question, the F-16. Where does it fit in the relationship? How come it became such a pivotal issue, subject between the two sides? Because if you remember, Turkey not only purchased, but received the permission to produce under license the F-16s back in early 1980s. This is like 4 decades ago, something Turkey could get 40 years ago, cutting edge technology, the most modern fighter aircraft at the time, at least among the ones available for export at the time, we could get the production license. And then 40 years on, the same aircraft, we could not get the permission even to upgrade the existing aircraft or add a few more examples to it. I mean, how come there was such a big, dramatic turnaround in the relationship, and how come Turkey's leverage against United States has been weakened so much? What made Turkey so much weaker in the relationship? That's probably one of the aspects of the question that is being missed. I mean, we lost major ground vis-a-vis United States, vis-a-vis Washington during the last 40 years. If you look at the case of F-16, we bought those aircraft, we purchased them, ordered them in early 1980s. I'm not going to spend time with details, but we have purchased over, like starting from 80s, first 160, then in mid-1990s, we ordered a further 80, which were also manufactured in Turkey. And then we finally, in early 2010s, more recently, around 15 years ago, we ordered another 30 to round it up to 270 aircraft. Around 230 of those are still flying, and they are forming the mainstay of not only Turkish Air Force combat aircraft fleet, but also the mainstay of Turkey's deterrent posture, defense posture. Honestly, they are the most important firepower element in Turkey's inventory, even today, after 40 years, okay? And not only that, in the context of Turkey's defense industry, which we are very proud of the phenomenal development progress that has been made over the last 40 years in developing the local capabilities, F-16s played a pivotal role again. Because yes, Turkey had defense industry capabilities even before then, but what F-16 local or joint production or licensed production is the correct term, brought to Turkish industry was not the physical capabilities, but it was the intangible capabilities. It was the quality assurance culture, it was the production culture, it was the human resources, it was up to the most advanced modern Western standards Turkey learned to produce weapon systems. And this is a legacy that continues on even today. If we are exporting 4, 5, 6, $7 billion worth of defense products, if you look at them, they are all taking advantage of the Western standards. They are all taking advantage of the Western culture, production cultures, products they are. They are not Eastern Bloc, they are not Chinese. And this was due mainly to the F-16 production, which was the first major program of its sort at the time. So we said F-16 was also the mainstay of Turkey's Air Force, thereby Turkey's commitment to NATO, thereby Turkey's relationship, defense sector relationship with the United States. And I believe even today, this continues. We rely on our F-16s for our air defense. Up until a few years ago, we didn't have land-based air defense in this country. Let's be honest about it, okay? We didn't have air defense in that country. We relied on F-16. We used our air-to-ground strike capability consisted primarily of F-16s. Yes, we had F-4s and all that, but those are outdated now. So especially for cross-border operations to Iraq, to Syria, we were able to use F-16s very extensively. And interesting enough, despite the fact that United States, we had major disagreements, major issues with them, especially around Syria, but also in the past around northern Iraq and some of the so-called cross-border operations we conducted, they never intervened or they never raised objections on the basis of F-16s being used, nor United States tried to stop, for example, the supply of spare parts in order to control Turkey. They kept those two paradigms, those two areas quite separate from each other, which is still the case today. Despite all the difficulties, despite all the strong and poisonous rhetoric by both sides, what you see is our F-16s are flying uninterrupted. There are no issues, no logistic issues. Nothing like the Pakistanis experience when they exploded their first atomic bomb in 1980s, when their F-16s were grounded in the process, and the deliveries were also frozen at the time. So, I mean, we are using F-16s in several ways, and they seem to be like an insulated module in Turkey's relationship with United States. And this is not out of United States love for Turkey, of course, because F-16s constitute a major firepower in the region, which also helps the United States in general. I mean, be it Iran, be it Russia, be it other regional actors, it is also in the interest of United States to keep that potent air power element in the region. Now, we have kept our F-16s. We modernized them. We did that. Unfortunately, of course, they are getting old. The oldest examples are more than 40 years in age already, okay? So we need to start replacing them by 2030s, the latest. in pieces, of course, not all at once, because they entered in inventory in over a 25-year span of time. But even before that, our F4s, the Phantoms, famous, venerable, they are already at the end of their operational life. And Turkish Air Force, of course, I mean, any major air power in the world would have this foresight, 10 years, 20 years, 25 years foresight about this force structure. So it had very diligently formed its plans in late 90s in order to replace F4s and then the F-16s with the replacement of F-16 at the time, which was presented as JSF, or what we call F-35 nowadays, okay? And Turkey joined, again, around F-16, another major cooperation involving Turkey became F-35, through which Turkish industry invested in a major way and learned in a major way until we were excluded from that program. We had billions of dollars worth of involvement in production. We had several capabilities, and we had also training, doctrinal gains for the Turkish Air Force. So that was the F-35 program. Now we tend to overlook that, but until a few years ago, it was at the center of Turkish defense industry. Now it's gone. It's out. Okay, I mean, we can discuss. This may take another panel discussion, whether it was good, whether it was bad, what were the real costs. But around F-16 replacement this time with F-35, the F-16s have also again been in the picture, at the center of American-Turkish defense relations. Now, Turkey has been kicked out of F-35 program. This has opened a major gap in Turkey's operational posture in the Air Force and overall deterrent posture as well. Well, Turkey luckily has had some schemes to develop its own fighter aircraft, what we call MMU, TFX, the National Combat Aircraft, the English word for that. Okay, and let me see how I'm doing time-wise. I think I have another 5 minutes perhaps, or shall I? Okay, 5 minutes, very good. So with that, Turkey hoped to achieve a dual capability even before F-35 program was, well, Turkey's involvement in it was terminated. And that was like the F-35 being acquired, but in parallel to Turkey developing its national combat aircraft. They will go hand in hand. Well, F-35 would arrive around in 2020, whereas the plan was to have the local fighters like 5 or 8 years afterwards. Thereby, the gap left by F-4, then the gap to be left by the retirement of F-16s will be filled in, which reflected Turkey's new approach to defense industry. Yes, I mean, ongoing relationship with the West, but at the same time constituting its own pillar, indigenous, local pillar of production, okay? Now, the American ingredient in that, or the Western ingredient, because F-35, let's again make an analysis here, it's not purely American now. It's not a matter of Turkish-American relations. F-35 has become the combat aircraft of NATO. Almost all NATO countries have ordered that aircraft. It has become an integrated, central part of NATO strategies, force structures, for the future, with a few exceptions like France. Almost everybody else with sizable militaries are using F-35, except for Turkey. We are proud of being the second largest NATO army or military in NATO, but we are at the same time the only major military other than France within NATO without F-35s in its inventory. Now, this is going to have some long-term ramifications. I'm not going to elaborate, perhaps in the question and answer period. So Turkey decided to close the gap left with its exclusion from F-35 program by ordering additional F-16s, what we call the Block 70, the latest configuration. And on top of that, to upgrade a certain number, 79, of its older F-16s up to the standard of that latest Block 70, the Viper configuration, okay? The problem is, whereas Turkey has had the backing, the full support of US in the Cold War environment of 1980s, could get even the production license for the aircraft, is facing a major obstacle in getting the approval of first the administration and nowadays the Congress in getting that aircraft. I think the main point here is in the past, Turkey always has had issues in its defense acquisition from United States. And there were blockades, there were restrictions on certain technologies that Turkey wanted. There were even certain equipment whose delivery was frozen, like the Whiskey Cobras in 1990s is a dramatic example. Those of you old enough would remember. None of you is in that category here today, except for me, okay? Early 1990s. And there were always issues around Greece, Turkey, 7-to-10 ratio, and Turkey's operations in Iraq, elsewhere, Eastern Mediterranean gas equation and all that. But I think what has changed dramatically, especially after 2013, this is where I'm going to draw the line with Gezi incidents, and on top of that, the Syria crisis. What has happened Turkey has managed to lose one by one all its supporters in Washington, within Congress, within media, within administration, within Defense Department. And where we are faced today, yes, the administration for practical and interest-wise issues is still interested in keeping Turkey at bay, keeping Turkey as an important, and treating Turkey as an important ally. The Defense Department, at least part of it, seems to be in favor of that. The State Department seems to be in favor of that, but we have lost totally the support of Congress. And in the US system, if you have no friends whatsoever in one of the legs of that decision-making process, you have major difficulty. And I think this is the major difficulty we are having. And the problem here is the reason why we have lost the support in the US, Congress especially, and public opinion and media as well, which are pretty important in US, is not necessarily for reasons related to Turkey's national interests. It's not YPG. For example, it is like more simpler issues, like beating of demonstrators at Dupont Circle has been a lot more dramatic in inflicting the damage, okay? And the negative image of Turkey when it comes to human rights, freedom of expression, the treatment of media or journalists in Turkey, true or not, there has been a major amount of negative publication against Turkey. So this has cost us all our friendships. So what we see today, and those are going to be my wrapping up comments, I'm not going to come to the major question like what will happen if F-16 is not approved? What are the options of Turkey? Perhaps we could address that in question and answer. But the wrapping up point is the problems we are having in defense relations right now. First, it is much smaller in size, scale, in areas other than F-16 as compared to 1980s or 90s. The interactions between Turkish and American defense industries are very small. It has come down to F-16, which constitutes the mainstay, even today, of Turkish defense industry. And there, the problem, in my opinion, is not primarily with the US military, US State Department or US administration. It is more the loss of support on Turkey's side with respect to US Congress, US media, US public opinion. We have suffered politically in that country, and we cannot carry on the national interest, security interests based policies, importance attached to Turkey. That was the case in 1990s or 2000s. And with that, I stop. Thank you for listening me.
Thank you very much, Sıtkı Hocam. I took a lot of notes, as always, when I listen to your presentations, the technical details. You mentioned the logistical and the organic need for F-35, but how we come up to F-16 and its upgrades. You mentioned a very important line, and you said that Turkey is has lost its allies and its supporters in Washington. And this has become a very important political and strategic issue, but it also has legal components. So I would like to give the floor to Mr. Shafak Erdem to talk about the deal of F-16 and its legal repercussions, its legal processes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Sometimes I feel myself as I'm not speaking about the politics, and because on the one hand, the Secretary of State of Antony Blinken says that there is no link between Sweden and the Turkey's F-16 deal. And on the other hand, Biden says that I spoke to Erdogan and he still wants to work on something on the F-16s, and so let's get it done. Today, I will emphasize more about the Sweden's perspective because there are some issues that is linked to the political concerns from the legal perspective and the situation in the Sweden. Almost 4 decades ago, Sweden former Prime Minister Olof Palme was assassinated on a Stockholm's busy street. And we all know that the killer has never been found. And it was defined as a terrorist attack by some experts. And after that time, Sweden has severally debated introducing an anti-terrorism legislation but those efforts has been hampered by human rights activities, and the new legislation has been first proposed in 2017 following the Stockholm truck attack. Sweden's parliament has approved a new anti-terrorism law, which was set enter into force on this month, June 1st, and we are talking about the country which is one of the highest scores, which also one of the highest scores in the Human Development Index, and places the 7th on the worldwide ranking. So Sweden's legal structure and some EU concerns from the legal perspectives, and the NATO is over there, and there are too many discussions all around these topics. And we know that since the NATO's last summit, 29 allies have approved Sweden's application, and Turkey and Hungary remained. And we see that the Sweden's path to NATO membership is based on fundamental 3 problems: the war in Ukraine, and the trilateral memorandum and the ratification process, and the anti-terror law of the Sweden. The anti-terror law that came into force on June in Sweden will also be examined by the EU. That's important because it should be consistent with the EU's, and there should be no violation of the EU rules, which was launched in 2021. So the EU Commission initiated a rules violation procedure against Stockholm in 2021 on the grounds that some elements in the EU's anti-terrorism rules were not reflected correctly in Sweden anti-terrorism laws. And the Commission made a formal notification to the Swedish government in November 2021, and the EU said its demands were not properly transposed into Swedish law. So Sweden is not the only country that can make some and enact a new laws on the anti-terrorism. It should also comply with the EU legislations. And regarding the NATO perspective and the trilateral memorandum between Turkey, Sweden, and Finland, we know that one of the key elements of the alliance is unwavering solidarity and cooperation in fight against terrorism, but in all forms of terrorism and the manifestation which constitutes a direct threat to the national security of any ally, as well as to international peace and the security. This is the general concept and approach. As the prospective NATO allies, Finland and Sweden extend their full support to Turkey against threats to its national security. That effect, Finland and Sweden will not provide support to YPG, PYD, and the organization of Gülen movement called FETÖ. And Turkey also extends its full support to Finland and Sweden against threats to their national security. Uh, Finland and Sweden reject and condemn terrorism in all its forms and in the strongest terms, and unambiguously condemn all terrorist organizations perpetrating attacks against Turkey and express their deepest solidarity with Turkey and the families of the victims. Finland and Sweden, they both confirm that PKK is a proscribed terrorist organization, and they commit to prevent the activities of the PKK and all other terrorist organizations and their extensions. And Turkey, Finland, Sweden have agreed to step up a cooperation to prevent the activities of these terrorist groups, and the Finland and Sweden reject the goals of these terrorist organizations. And these two countries, the Finland and Sweden, will conduct the fight against the terrorism with determination to resolve in accordance with the provisions of the relevant NATO documents and the policies, and will take all required steps. This is what has been agreed upon the document. But from the domestic law perspective, the newly adopted Terrorism Act has some, even it closes some loopholes in the anti-terrorism law. Sweden has not previously prohibited participation in a terrorist organization. So it's new for a Swedish society and the Swedish lawmakers. This means that there was a risk that those were not directly involved in perpetrating a specific terrorist act, but actively supported such activities in some other way. The new legislation also targets individuals who financially support other people's participation in terrorist organizations, or who publicly encourage or recruit others to join such organizations. It criminalizes the travel for the purpose of participating in terrorist activities outside Sweden. The basic minimum sentence is 4 years imprisonment in the terrorism law, and for the most serious offenses, it's a minimum of 2 and a maximum of 8 years imprisonment. For the leaders of the terrorist organization, it is between 2 years and a lifetime imprisonment. But who will apply this? And what will be a country that has not applied in many years any anti-terrorism law? So the implementation and the enforcement of this law is also important, and there are too many legal concerns within the Sweden and the debates that is around the different types of the courts. There is a Ministry of Justice, the general courts, the district courts, and the administrative courts in Sweden. And the Ministry of Justice is a cabinet level in the government of Sweden, headed by the Minister of Justice, is primarily concerned with the legislation and concerning the law enforcement. And the main body for the law enforcement in Sweden is the Swedish Police Authority. The prison and the probation service is the government agency handling prisons in Sweden. And there are 4 courts, as I mentioned: general, district, and the administrative, and the Supreme Courts. The general courts deal with the criminal cases, like an act defined in the Swedish Penal Code or in other law for which a sanction is prescribed, for example, theft or a robbery. And the general court also handles some civil law disputes, for example, the disputes over the contents of a business agreement or cases relating to family law. And the district courts of the Sweden are the court of the first instance for the general courts in Sweden. The next instance are the courts of the appeal, they call it hovrätt. And the district court handled the criminal cases and some civil law disputes and a number of non-continuous matters. There are now 48 district courts across Sweden, and the catchment area is based on the geographic boundaries of several municipalities. And the issue is arising around the administrative courts. The courts they are the first instance courts for the general administrative courts in Sweden, and the next instance are the administrative courts of appeal. The administrative courts handle numerous types of cases relating to disputes between private persons and the authorities. There are 12 administrative courts spread across the country. And the Supreme Courts, they handle the simple erroneous judicial decision making by the lower courts, is usually, which is not usually sufficient for the court to consider a case. In the current terrorism law, Turkey's primary concern is whether a district or administrative courts will enforce the requirements of the terrorism law according to the legal system in Sweden. Because while the general courts follow the newly adopted Terrorism Act, district or administrative courts may not enforce it in the same manner and in the same sense. It is underlined that the Turkish diplomatic efforts to combat terrorism in Sweden could not be implemented at the local government level. It might be across the country, but at the local government level, it cannot be applied by these courts, by these district courts, and which it binds the districts or the administrative courts and lock out the system. There could be a governance gap, I think, between Turkey's government and the Swedish local authorities during the conveying Turkey demands for the implementation of Sweden's Anti-Terrorism Act. So the issue is not easily a discussion by and between NATO and the Turkey and the Sweden. The Sweden has also their problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So all in all, this comes up to the main question of the complex relationship between Turkey and the US and Turkey's transatlantic ties, its relations with NATO. Actually, the Vilnius summit is not directly about Turkish-American relations or Turkey's relations with NATO, but it has many topics, very important ones, the Swedish application and NATO's defense postures that impacts Turkey-US relations. And also, the last two speakers mentioned the importance of F-16 and the deal and the processes and the challenges related. So thank you for all the presentations. And I would like to open the floor for questions and answers and kindly ask the participants to write their questions in chat or Q&A. In the meantime, we have a first question. Alperen Sevgil. The question is, how did NATO summit address Turkey's concerns regarding emerging threats or risks in the region? It is directed to Sıtkı Hoca, but also related to Ambassador Ceylan's presentation. So you may have the opportunity to elaborate deeper on the topic.
Sinem Hoca, since it's addressed to me, I take the floor, but I will pass the ball on to Ambassador Ceylan, if that's okay. Because first, the question is, which NATO summit are we talking about? There are several of them. Is it did NATO summit? So it's one of the summits in the past, I believe, our listener has in mind. And on top of that, of course, this is in the context of the regional security threats and risks, whereas my address was focused primarily, well, solely on the defense industry and F-16 dimension. Okay, you find quite the answers, very good. But I leave the floor to Fatih, Ambassador Fatih Ceylan, and if I need to, anything that crosses my mind in the process, I will also try to contribute.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Sıtkı Hoca. I mean, the relevant question was, which summit are we talking about? Most probably the Madrid summit. Let me try to explain it rather in a simple manner. The strategic concepts in NATO practice are very important for each and every member of the alliance. This is one thing. The second thing is that when it comes to threats and risks, almost every 2 years, NATO conducts a joint threat analysis, supported both by civilian and military intelligence agencies and consolidated at NATO. So in that joint threat analysis, JTA, every member tries to kind of include its concerns with regard to either actual threats or emerging threats. And this is approved, not approved, but noted by the Council. But if there are objections to it, the place to raise these issues is the intelligence agencies, be it military or civilian. To what extent NATO responds to emerging threats and risks for Turkey? I mean, this question could be asked maybe for the rest of the allies. Now, starting in 2017, if the gist of the question is reduced to terrorism as an emerging threat for Turkey, not only for Turkey but globally, starting in 2016 at the Warsaw Summit, continued at the Brussels Summit of 2017 and 2018, terrorism after 9/11 had become one of the main threats for the alliance and its members. And the previous acquis built on fighting terrorism or combating terrorism was re-energized upon the insistence of Turkey on different occasions. And a very comprehensive plan of action was, for instance, adopted in 2017 at the Brussels Summit. And it's been expanded since then. And the solid manifestation of it can be seen in the threat assessment part of the strategic concept. I mentioned that Russia is the most direct and significant threat for NATO, and terrorism in all its forms and manifestations is the most direct asymmetrical threat for NATO and its members. I mentioned that the time period starting from June 2022 up till now, the Vilnius summit, is an implementation year. So NATO will have to incorporate the implications of these direct threats into its plans, be it in a strategic sense or in a regional planning context. So then we will be able to see the degree of Turkey's desire to see more efforts on the part of the alliance to combat terrorism. But let me underline one simple fact. Fighting terrorism is primarily a national responsibility. And that is also included in a series of NATO documents, which Turkey accepted itself. But if there's an enormous terror attack, then the ally concerned could invoke Article 5. And the implementation of Article 5 is not an automatic process. The Council will have to convene and decide on the application of the concerned ally for invoking Article 5. So there's no automaticity in the implementation of Article 5, which is the backbone of collective defense of NATO. And so far, Turkey has never, ever applied to NATO to invoke Article 5. But when you look at the political scene in Turkey, many people talk about it, that we are facing terrorism. Yes, indeed. Terrorism in different forms and manifestations. Yes, indeed. And then the complaint that the allies is doing nothing about it. Now we have two instruments, or rather provisions, that you can leverage. One is Article 4, that's consultations. If one's ally is under, security is under threat, then that ally could go to the NATO Council and ask for consultations on that threat or risk that it's facing, this is automatic. Nobody can stop it. The implementation of Article 4 is automatic. But in the case of Article 5, it's a different story. And people mix it. Like for the first time, the invocation of Article 5 was done for the United States after 9/11, for the first time in the history of NATO. And the one thing that should be noted is that the United States itself did not ask the invocation of Article 5. The allies decided to invoke Article 5 at a special council meeting in the wake of 9/11. Because there's also a misperception in Turkey that the United States consulted NATO to invoke it. The United States does not need it, actually. But then NATO Council decided to invoke Article 5 and decided to send AWACS airplane, that's the early warning aircraft, to the United States as a sign of solidarity and a commitment on the part of the rest of the allies vis-a-vis the United States. So that's where we are. So what we have to do is, there are two things that Turkey should do on a priority basis. One is, while the joint threat analysis of NATO is being updated, Turkey will try to, or endeavor to put into that its inputs on how it sees the emerging threats and risks for itself. This is one thing. And the second thing is the implementation of the new strategic concept and its implementation documents, including the defense plans, either at the strategic level or at the operational level. Now, at the operational level, it will be regional plans, as far as I can see. So every country will try to include its concerns and its perception of threats, of emerging threats and risks for itself to those documents. And we will not see the end result of that because these documents are confidential. I mean, they are secret. But I'm sure that the Turkish authorities are trying to include Turkey's expectation or perceptions rather on the emerging threats and risk. It's an ongoing process. It never stops because threats change, evolve. Most probably, for instance, when you talk about emerging threats and risks, what comes to mind on the present circumstances is the new and emerging technologies that would disrupt many things, including security and defense. But we don't talk about such things in Turkey. Unfortunately, we just focus, or the public is forced to focus on a certain number of issues and then forget about the rest. There will be a big transformation within NATO to adapt itself, to adapt its deterrence and defense posture on the present circumstances, Russian aggression and asymmetrical threats, on what they call a 360-degree approach. That's a holistic approach, inclusive of actual and emerging threats and risks, which Turkey should leverage. So I wonder what the perception of the present Turkish leadership is on emerging threats and risks, because that will maybe define the moment when those documents are being prepared. Thank you.
Thank you. Sıtkı Hocam, I have two questions. One is, do you have any anticipation under what conditions Turkey would be let back in F-35 program? This is the first question. And the second is, will the purchase of F-16s by Ukraine, which is not a NATO member, accelerate Turkey's F-16 negotiations with the United States? So could you please respond to these two questions coming from the participants?
Sure, I will. This is more in my playing field, those two questions at least, as compared to the first one that Ambassador Ceylan has kindly answered and in great detail. The F-35, there are no guarantees we will go back, nor, well, I mean, there have been hints that Turkey is interested to be back. Honestly, I don't believe we will be going back into that program under the same terms and conditions that we entered the program 25 years ago. So we may end up buying the aircraft, but no one should expect anything like an industrial partnership being reconstituted. This one is gone. I'm sorry to say. I mean, we lost that opportunity. We lost that that benefit of being one of the tier 3 member of the consortium. Okay, now will or can Turkey get it under the current circumstances in any time in the near future? Considering that we have so many difficulties, even with F-16s, I do not see an approval coming from Congress or US administration for that. In fact, we will not be the first country whose application for F-35 would have been rejected. Like only this week, Thailand was turned down by United States. Their attempt or their desired wish to buy F-13s was kindly returned by United States. Because honestly, I mean, if United States is providing that aircraft, look at the list of countries to have achieved, received F-35s. I mean, Japan and a number of European countries, all NATO allies. Those are the kind of countries US would like to see part of its security network on a global scale. The countries they are counting on to operate together in the future. In other words, the countries they trust. Okay, I don't think this element of trust exists in Washington nowadays. It may be changing in coming days. There may be other dramatic turn of events, like the invasion of Ukraine has changed the landscape dramatically. If there is another development like that in the upcoming years, yes, I mean, perhaps the perception of US should change. But other than that, I don't expect that. Now, coming to the second question, I think it's related to the first one. The fact that Ukraine does get F-16s, I don't think it's going to facilitate. I mean, the Turkey's receipt of F-16s from Turkey, because they are I try to look at from the perspective of Washington, US decision makers and their contemplations about the issue they have. I mean, those are two separate issues. I mean, we gave it to Ukraine, so we should give it to Turkey as well. I don't think they will look at it this way. I mean, let's be honest about it. Rightly or wrongly, the Americans are very angry at Turkey. In my opinion, they are not right. I mean, this is a gorilla. I mean, it is always risky to go in bed with gorilla. United States is a superpower. At least it has still the psychology of a superpower. And if you step on their toes, they overreact. They react very strongly. And they have this, like, I mean, okay, if this is how you want to deal with us, I'll show you how to deal with me kind of attitude. And I think this is advertently or inadvertently what Turkey has achieved in pissing off United States during its relationship over the last 10 years or so. Okay, will that change very fast? I don't think so, honestly. So F-35, F-16, I continue them to continue carry on as they have so far. And I stop here because with all due respect, there are other panelists and I don't want to steal the entire panel here.
Sinem Hocam, can I intervene for a few minutes? I mean,
there are lots of questions.
If you give me the floor.
I will come back to you, but
okay.
Because there are questions that I would like to pose, the questions of participants, but now I would like to turn to Shafak Bey. Ambassador Ümit Yardım has a question about different understandings of Turkey and Sweden when it comes to terrorism. I'm not going to read the whole question if you have read it so far, Şafak Bey, but it's for the other participants who are not reading, it's about the differences of opinion when it comes to terrorism. And the last part of the question is about last year's trilateral paper, which Sweden has fulfilled the undertakings vis-a-vis has not fulfilled. There's a doubt vis-a-vis what Turkey expected. And further Swedish actions against terror by amendments in constitution and new law are not tailor-made for Turkish demands, but general framework that may be used against radical religions. This clash will be continuing in the years ahead, and he's wondering your comments, Şafak Bey.
Definitely, that's not an issue about the commenting one issue from another. That's all about to ensure it at the country level. So the concern from the Turkey side is that whether the district courts or at the local government level can have a different approach for anti-terrorism laws, because Sweden is very new in the anti-terrorism laws. And the Turkey's expectation is to implement it at the government level and the countrywide at the same degree, but the district courts may have some, the differences in the implementation and the enforcement of the law. So that is the question mark in the Turkey side, and the legal concern from the Turkey side about the Sweden's legal system. It's not about Sweden is enforcing it differently. It is a concern about that.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Ceylan, I have a couple of questions, and I'm going to combine them because they're mostly about Swedish accession to NATO. Also, I would like to hear your comments, your interventions to the prior questions, and we will finish up with your comments.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Yeah.
The first question is about the negotiations. Do you think that, I'm reading the last part, the question part, do you think we have conducted a successful negotiation or received good concessions from the American side about Swedish acceptance? Or is it difficult for a regional power like us to force a superpower to act in accordance with our interests? So this is the first question. The second is about Russia. Is Russia going to sit idly if Sweden joins NATO? And how it is going to affect Russian willingness to turn Turkey into an energy hub? So one side of the coin is US relations, and the other is the Russian reactions. And there is also another question about Sweden's membership for NATO, and it is related to EU. After accepting Sweden's membership for NATO, will we be accepted to EU? We all know the answer. Why don't EU accept Turkey's membership? Even all they are aware that we have very important and strategic concept role for the EU. Maybe the EU part is another panel, of course. And so there's a third pillar right now, the Russian pillar, US pillar, and then the EU pillar. And another question is very much related to the EU part as well. The security architecture of NATO in the context of the EU is in discrepancy, and Turkey's difficult political situation suffers enormously. Could it be that Turkey is not lobbying Brussels enough? And that fourth question is about the Turkish reaction. So I'm leaving you with very tough questions. I know that the answers are very hard to tell. And you could give your remarks to the previous questions and maybe conclude the panel with your remarks, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Sinem Hocam. I mean, you have left hot potatoes on my lap. with some very ambitious questions. It's not easy to respond to each one of them in a satisfactory manner, but let me try to do my best. Now, first of all, I should like to stress one point, that Sweden is not run by a presidential system, but the Swedish system is based on separation of powers. I think many people in Turkey seem to forget about the separation of powers part of it. And when you look at the trilateral memorandum signed at Madrid on the 28th of June 2022, last year, just before the Madrid summit, the part on it goes like that. Turkey, Finland, and Sweden will have to, now these two countries will take into consideration the applications by Turkey with regard to fighting terrorism thoroughly and expeditiously as soon as possible, but they need a bilateral legal framework. Look at the concerned part of that, the operational part of it. Plus, that should be in conformity with the European Convention on Extradition, okay? So we cannot simply bypass these points in the trilateral memorandum. And we are negotiating with a country whose system is based on separation of powers. Many segments of our society seem to forget what separation of power means. You have independent and neutral judiciary. You have an executive branch and you have a legislative branch. I mean, this is 1.0 in political science in terms of separation of powers. It's not a presidential system. At least the one that we have is entirely different from the political system of Sweden. And I think we should keep that in mind constantly. With regard to negotiations on potential accession of Sweden to NATO, at the very beginning, I remember, I mean, it was, I think, May the 13th when the Turkish president made a remark on it that we are not approaching favorably to the accession of Sweden and Finland to NATO. And then the whole process started. There were two conflicting views. One said that because it was said publicly, which is not always the preferred option of diplomacy, of course. I mean, in diplomacy, sometimes behind the scenes channels are much better, or back channels are much better, rather than going to public, particularly on such sensitive issues. The other view was that he did it right. Otherwise, it could have been impossible to sign that trilateral memorandum, which I don't agree, by the way, because there was a kind of vacillation on the part of Turkey. There were two telephone conversations, one with the Finnish president in April 2022, and a series of contacts between Turkey and Sweden at different levels, at different political levels, I mean. So it was evident that Sweden was going to apply for accession to NATO, and Finland. The negotiations could have been diplomatic negotiations in a calmer way, could have been conducted, and the same end result could have been achieved, because we needed something in a written form, and that's what we had on the eve of the Madrid summit. Well, there are two conflicting views. My view is clear. I would have preferred a much calmer, behind the scenes diplomacy to be leveraged. And maybe we could have even attained better results. Who knows? So far, because the trilateral memorandum set in motion a diplomatic process, joint permanent mechanism, right? With the participation of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Justice, security forces, intelligence forces, and Ministry of Defense. And there was a flexibility for the others to join. That's what's written in the trilateral memorandum, for the others to join. So it was not confined to Finland and Sweden only, or the other state institutions or agencies. Well, anyway, so now Finland's accession is over. The Turkish parliament ratified it, and we are waiting for Turkey to make its decision on what it would like to do with regard to Sweden. But one thing is important, one thing it should be underlined, that if we drag our feet too much on the accession of Sweden, we will have additional thorny issues or challenges to come forward, not only with the United States, but with the rest of the alliance. That should also be kept in mind constantly. So there will be a bill to pay. So the question is to the public, are you ready to pay the bill? What happened in the F-35 issue? And I wonder why Sutkoca never mentioned the scene setter for that challenge. It's the procurement, the decision to procure S-400s. And the main argument was the United States was not ready to sell Patriots to Turkey. It's a figment of imagination, because it was not it was not a off-the-shelf arrangement. We had a series of criteria to be met. The main idea was to co-produce such systems. F-35 was a consortium, and Turkey was a part of it, producing components for F-35. So there was a technology sharing, know-how, plus rich benefits in the magnitude of billions of dollars for this co-production. So F-35 is simply not an aircraft. It's technology and it's material benefits for the defense industry of Turkey. These all became the victim of the decision to procure S-400s. This is the fact. And the only system to be quote unquote procured was not the Patriot systems. There were consultations and negotiations with the Eurosam system. That's the European system. It's a consortium of France and Italy. So it was a wrong decision, a bad decision. It was a strategic misstep on the part of Turkey. We lost many things, including the realm of defense industry. Now, I'm sure that experts on this issue will agree with that. Now, will Russia do something if Sweden becomes a NATO member? No. What can it do? Declare war on NATO? And I think the Russian leadership is already ready for the accession of Sweden as well, after Finland. And I'm not sure, I mean, this is also controversial. Turning Turkey to an energy hub. If that means more dependence on Russia in energy, I would not like this idea. I think it's much better and would be in compliance with our national interests to diversify our sources of energy and focus more and more on clean and renewable energy and invest in clean and renewable energy. Anything that heightens the dependence of Turkey on Russia in energy, I think would not be a good idea for Turkey to pursue. Now, regarding the linkage between Sweden membership to NATO and Turkey's membership to the EU, I think that is simply unrealistic. In terms of our membership in the EU, we did not achieve any progress. Both sides committed mistakes in dealing with each other. But I think our basic conundrum is that There had been an erosion in our own democratic standards, weakening of separation of powers, and also not paying due respect to civil liberties, fundamental rights and liberties in the society. So, I mean, this is how Turkey is perceived by Europe, apart from the EU, and by the West at large. I think for our own benefit, the sooner we adopt democracy based on pluralism, civil liberties, and rule of law, the better for the future of Turkey. As long as we do not attain these objectives, these fundamental objectives for ourselves, for our society, I don't care how the EU thinks, but we have to go back to these fundamental aspects of democracy enshrined in the documents, treaties, agreements Turkey signed, starting in the aftermath of World War II. So we have to abide by these treaties and agreements. I think this is the precondition for Turkey itself. And we should not mix, apples and oranges. If we make a progress in these important domains of democracy, in these walks of democracy, then I think the main responsibility will lie on the shoulders of the EU to decide. But it's a long way. It's a bridge too far right now. Regarding the discrepancy between EU and NATO, yes, of course. I mean, when you look at the EU's strategic compass, for instance, what it foresees under present circumstances, we are talking about March 22, when Russia initiated its second wave of attacks against Ukraine. The force structure is 5,000 strong men for a rapid intervention force and 200 civilians. So the total is 5,200. What can you do with it vis-a-vis Russia? Nothing. So there is such a discrepancy, at least in the forces to be assigned for countering, for instance, the Russian threat. So the EU will have to rely on NATO in terms of its security and collective defense. And this discrepancy will not be surmounted in the foreseeable future. Turkey could be a pivotal player, of course, in terms of providing security to the EU, if it continues, if it acts in a wise manner. When the EU started this process back in the early 2000s, Turkey decided to allocate reinforced brigade to the EU, which shocked the EU because we were far ahead many countries, including, for instance, like Germany. But following that, the initial stages of Turkey's quote-unquote involvement in European security and EU's security and defense, again, because of the challenges we faced, it is now inconceivable for Turkey, for instance, to announce such a contribution. Maybe we should try to kind of change their chemistry by taking such steps like we did in the early 2000s. But I believe that this is not on the agenda of Turkey's political leadership for different reasons. So the EU's military capacity and capability is not enough to counter the present threats in the middle of Europe. And the EU will have to rely on the transatlantic alliance. There's no doubt about it. And Turkey should play a constructive role between the two wings of the alliance. One is the United States, the leading member of NATO, and the other is the European countries. So we should endeavor to maintain the right balance between the American and European pillars of NATO. But the current picture suggests that we have problems with both pillars of the alliance. We should be overcome. The sooner the better, hopefully. If not, then we have a big problem. We have bigger problems then, not only with the alliance, but with the West at large. So these are my last words. Thank you very much, Sinem Hocam, and thank you to the audience for their patience. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your wrapping up remarks as well. It has been a very productive panel, specifically about US-Turkey relations and F-16s, F-35s, and all the debates and challenges regarding the defense industry. I would like to thank all the panelists for devoting their time to their valuable presentations, and all the participants at this hour listening to us, listening to the debates and posing the questions. Our webinar is over, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, have a nice evening.